up, me mateys. On this episode of Once Upon a Real Life with Belle, we are going to learn about a mighty warship built to dazzle a king. But before we do, if you are enjoying these podcasts, please comment and share with your friends. It helps with the reach of the podcast. Okay, so where were we? The year is 1628, and we're going to Stockholm, Sweden. The Vasa, a formidable warship, sets sail on its maiden voyage with a sensational display, only to sink within minutes, close to the shipyard, right in Stockholm's harbour, in front of thousands of Stockholm residents and foreign ambassadors. For centuries, the Vasa was lost to history, and in 1961 she rose again, almost perfectly preserved. My special guest, Fred from the Vasa Museum in Stockholm, Sweden, is here to share the Vasa's incredible story, drama, ambition, disaster, and ultimately one of the greatest underwater recoveries in history. Welcome, Fred.
Thanks, Bill.
Now, let's start with a bit of the history of the Vasa. Who commissioned her to be built?
I'm going to make one slight correction for you before I say that. Vasa is not a she. That is a modern English habit of calling ships she. In Sweden in the 17th century, the ship had the gender of its name. So if the ship's name was Maria, it would be she. But if the ship's name was Apollo, it was he. And if the ship's name was the unicorn, it was it. So, and we know from historical sources where it's talked about, Vasa was considered a he, not a she. Right. The person who wanted Vasa built was the King of Sweden, Gustav II Adolf, or we just call him Gustav Adolf, who was in the process of completely reforming the military of Sweden because he felt that Sweden could punch above its weight and could compete with the larger countries of Europe to the south. But in order to do that, he needed to field a modern, up-to-date, and powerful military machine. And in the 1610s, he'd overhauled the army and the artillery train to produce a field army that could compete. And in the 1620s, he started doing the same thing with his navy, because the battles he was going to fight were all on the other side of the Baltic. And he needed a capable navy that could get his army to the front and keep it supplied and keep it informed and compete against any of the other navies that might come into the Baltic. And so in the 1620s, he started ordering new ships. Well, the Sweden's enemies in those days were to the east, you had Russia, which had largely been subdued by at the beginning of his reign and really didn't play a role in the 17th century. In the south, you had Poland, Lithuania, which was ruled by Gustav Adolf's first cousin, who also claimed to be the king of Sweden. And so there was a dynastic squabble there. You also had Germany and the German Empire, also to the south. And then to the west, you had Denmark and Norway under the same king. And so all of those were potential enemies. And in fact, Sweden fought wars against all of them in the course of the 17th century.
Wow. So are we thinking, so he was by birth, this Gustav was by birth the king, but his cousin across the sea wanted that position?
Well, his cousin Sigmund had been king of Sweden in the 1590s, but he was Catholic, and he was also the king of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania. And it's actually really difficult to be the king of two different countries at the same time, especially if they have different languages, different systems of government, different religions, Catholic versus Lutheran, and competing economic interests. And so Gustav Adolf's father, who was Sigismund's uncle, decided that he needed to be got rid of. So he started a rebellion and threw Sigismund out of Sweden and then made himself king as Karl IX. And then his son, Gustav Adolf, succeeded him. So Sigismund believed that his throne had been usurped and that he was still the rightful king of Sweden. And then Gustav Adolf believed that that they were not usurpers, but that Sigismund had been lawfully deposed because he had not been looking out for the interests of Sweden. And so that was a long festering conflict between the kings of Sweden and Denmark, or Sweden and Poland, until the 1660s.
So was that an army battle?
Well, there were battles within Sweden during the Civil War of the 1590s. There were also naval maneuvers. And then in 1621, Gustav Adolf decided to teach his cousin a lesson, and so he invaded Poland. Started in Lithuania, invaded, and took the city of Riga, and then fought a series of land campaigns with his army, trying to move south and west from Riga until he could capture Warsaw.
So there's a serious history there. Now, so the ship. So we have a fleet. We were able to run some war campaigns. Tell me about the Vasa. What was the idea behind building this ship?
Well, Vasa really embodies the king's vision of what naval warfare was going to be. Very different from what the Navy thought naval warfare was going to be. The typical Swedish warship had about somewhere between 20 and 30 guns. And usually the biggest ships were armed with 12-pounders. That is a cannon that fires a ball that weighs 12 pounds, and only on one deck of guns. But the king's vision of the future was that naval warfare would be artillery duels between these heavily armed gun platforms, much bigger ships, many more guns, and much heavier guns. And so in the winter of 1624, 1625, he signed a contract for the construction of 4 new ships. 2 of those would be the traditional kind that the Navy was used to. And then the other 2 would be an entirely new type with 2 full decks of guns and much heavier guns, 24-pounders instead of 12-pounders. Because he believed that the naval weapon of the future was cannon, the Navy still believed that the primary weapon of a ship was its crew, and that naval actions would be decided by boarding, by hand-to-hand combat, by men armed with axes and spears.
And he had a different idea.
Well, a very different idea that he was a keen artillerist himself. He was very passionately interested in and knowledgeable about cannon and artillery and how you would use those on the battlefield. And so he thought that the Navy could benefit from better artillery as well. And so he started thinking about not just new ships, but new kinds of ships that would be designed around artillery as the main weapon.
And did he have his own shipbuilders, or did he engage somebody in particular?
Well, just in the 1620s, the state was attempting an experiment in privatization, we would call it today, or outsourcing. And that is, instead of the Navy building its own ships at a state-run shipyard, instead they leased the state's shipyard to private entrepreneurs, to businessmen, and then simply paid them cash to deliver ships. It was a system that only lasted about 10 years and ended up not working because the tax base they had created that also used private entrepreneurs just didn't function. But it did shift Sweden onto a cash basis for its government. But so these private entrepreneurs were given a contract and then were to be paid cash, and in return they would deliver the ships.
And this ship behind me is one of those ships. This is the Vasa.
Right. That's the first of that new class of ships, what we sometimes call the Vasa class, these very large, much larger warships with 2 full decks of guns armed with much heavier artillery.
And so we have a commission, we have a shipbuilder, it begins to be built, and what happens?
Right. Keel was laid in February or March of 1626, and it took about a year and a half to build the ship.
And was the shipbuilder concerned about the wishes of the king's request of 2 levels of cannons?
We can see that the contract provides the basic dimensions for the ship, how long it should be and how wide it should be. But we can see that they actually built Vasa more than a meter wider than the contract said it should be, which suggests the shipbuilder might have thought that original specification was not right. The problem was it needed not to be wider, it needed to be deeper.
Yeah.
But because of the way that the ships were built and the way the timber was procured, it was physically possible to make a ship wider. It was not possible to make it deeper once you bought in the timber.
And then the depth also of the Stockholm harbour.
Well, the Stockholm harbor is very deep. I mean, where the ship sank, it's 32 meters deep. So the Swedish waters aren't, for the most part, that shallow. But the shipwright was from the Netherlands, and he was used to building ships in the Dutch style, which are relatively shallow drafted because they're designed for Dutch waters. You don't need to do that in Sweden, but that was the kind of ship that he liked to build. But we also know from other ships that he built that he, even for a Dutch shipwright, he preferred very, very shallow draft hulls, which is fine if you're only carrying one deck of guns. But if you've got so much height that you're carrying two decks of guns, that kind of shallow hull just doesn't work.
So the correspondence would have been obviously by letter. So the king would communicate, I would imagine, with the shipbuilder, or did he just leave that, this is what I want, build it?
That's actually pretty interesting. The king was on campaign in Poland for most of the time that Vasa was being built, and even when they were starting to think about the design. And so there is some exchange of letters between the king and the vice admiral in charge of procurement, and then the vice admiral would talk to the shipwright. The king didn't write directly to the shipwright. And we see in this exchange of letters in the fall of 1625, there is already some discussion about, based on the contract, in what order the ships that were contracted should be built. And while they were having that discussion, a third of the Navy sank in a single storm off the coast of what's now Latvia.
Oh.
And so there was some scrambling to figure out how could they rebuild the number of ships as quickly as possible. And so the king suggested a third design with the idea that the timber that had already been bought in to build one of the Vasa type ships and one of the smaller ships in the contract could somehow be mixed and matched to build two medium-sized ships. And the shipwright had to explain that it doesn't work that way. We can't do that. But so there was some discussion, and there's enough discussion there and exchanging of dimensions to see that the king was actually pretty knowledgeable. He understood the basic concepts of the shipbuilding process and could understand, once the shipwright explained it, that he was going to have to build a big ship and a small ship. He couldn't build the medium-sized ships. That's later led to a lot of confusion by people who have misread those documents to assume that the design of Vasa was changed, which is not, in fact, the case. There was some discussion before the ship was built about changing the design of the smaller ship, but not changing the design of Vasa. Vasa is pretty much the ship they intended to build from the beginning.
Yeah. And even with the weight distribution issue?
Well, yes. The problem there is that the ship is too tall for the amount of ship that's in the water, and it's taller than it needs to be. I can walk around in the gun decks on Vasa without ducking my head, and I'm taller than any sailor of the 17th century. I'm a meter 80, and our average sailor is less than a meter 70. And so there's a lot of headroom in the decks that doesn't need to be there.
So had that extra deck room have been shortened, could there have been a different outcome for the sailing of the ship?
There could well have been. And the other, combined with the fact that the decks are too tall, they're too heavily built. All the deck beams are much bigger than they really need to be for the weights they're carrying. They're too closely spaced. There's too many of them, which makes the deck structure itself much heavier than it needs to be. And so that's a lot of extra weight high up in the ship, which also contributes to making the ship top heavy.
Yeah, very top heavy. And am I right in saying that halfway through the build, the ship builder passed away and a new builder came in?
He had been ill all through construction and gradually had been handing over more responsibility to his number one assistant, who was also a master shipwright. They're both named Henrik, which gets to be a little confusing. So Henrik Hibbertsson is the guy who signed the contract, and then he handed off responsibility to another Henrik Jakobsen, although we normally call him Hein Jakobsen, which is a Dutch nickname for Henrik.
He'd been on board since the beginning.
Right. He'd been working there at the Navy Yard for 5 years before they started working on Vasa. And he was quite an accomplished shipwright. In fact, he built better ships than Master Henrik Hubertson did. So he gradually took over more and more responsibility for Vasa as Henrik Hubertson got more and more ill. But yeah, Henrik died. The designer died about the time that the ship was being launched. But he had handed off responsibility for supervising its construction quite a few months before that.
And were they confident at that time that this was a floatable ship?
That's a good question. And there are some indications that they might have already been worried even before it was in the water. Because there's while before Vasa was launched, Hein Jakobsen started building the second big ship, Vasa's sister ship, in theory to the same design. That's a ship named Eplet, or the Apple. And we can see that ship he built a meter wider than Vasa, even before he knew that Vasa was unstable. So before he'd even launched Vasa, he'd already decided to build the next ship to theoretically the same design. He built and added yet another meter of width to it, which suggests that he thought Vasa was probably going to have some problems.
Still 2 levels of guns on that ship?
Otherwise the same length, same depth, still 2 decks of guns, same number of gun ports.
I heard a story that when they were testing the floatability of Vasa, that the crewmen would run from one side to the other.
Right, it's called sallying the ship. And sometimes that's portrayed as a stability test, but it was really a demonstration. It's reported in the inquest after the ship sank that the captain, who was responsible for supervising the construction of Vasa, dragged the admiral in charge of procurement down to the ship and then had him watch while he ordered 30 sailors to run back and forth across the upper deck to make the ship roll, to show the admiral that the ship wasn't safe. Because he was trying to stop the ship from being sent to sea before it could be fixed. And the admiral was heard to remark at the time that he wished the king were at home. So, in other words, so the king could make a decision about what to do, and he wouldn't have to take the responsibility. He ordered the ship to sea. The one thing he did do was he replaced the man who was supposed to be Vasa's captain with the man who had organized this demonstration, who had been supervising the construction. Not a bad idea, really, because that person, whose name was Søfring Hansen, presumably knew more about the ship, knew the ship better than anyone else. So he would be the logical person to put in charge of sailing a brand new ship with questionable behavior.
And for the very first sailing of the ship, for the launch, where was the Vasa to go?
Vasa was supposed to be the flagship of a small reserve squadron of 4 ships that would stay in Swedish waters awaiting orders, because the Swedish Navy was in that year, in 1628, was fighting in 2 different theaters. They were assisting to relieve the siege of Stralsund in Germany, and they were blockading the Polish port of Gdańsk. And so it wasn't sure where reinforcements would be needed. So they were keeping a squadron of reserve ships that could be sent to either one of those places. So Vasa was only based in the Stockholm archipelago, in Swedish waters, and awaiting orders. And it was relatively late in the season by then when Vasa sailed in August. So
they had enough food and water and items to be sitting in the archipelago for quite a while?
Not really. The ship isn't very well provisioned yet, because there was a reprovisioning base where it was going to be stationed. And so they would take on more food if they were going to sail away from the country. There's 2 large storage rooms in the hold where they probably would have stored provisions that are largely empty when the ship was found. There is a storage room for meat, for salted meat that's full, 65 barrels of salted beef and pork and mutton. But not. There should have been hundreds of barrels of beer and flour and bread and other things like that just aren't there.
Yeah. And how many crewmen went on that very first mission?
The total crew of the ship in service would have been about 450 men, and about a third of those are sailors sailing the ship, and the other two-thirds are Marines or soldiers who would man the guns and fight a battle if necessary. But you only took the soldiers on board if you were going to war. So they weren't on board at this point, only the sailing crew, which would be about 150 people. That includes carpenters, a barber, a priest, cooks, people like that. But in addition, we often don't just talk about the crew of a ship, we talk about a ship's community. The crew are the people who are paid to be there. But there are other people who are on board ships as well, very often as semi-permanent members of the community. The Swedish Navy allowed sailors to have their wives living on board as long as the ship was in home waters. And so women were part of the ship's community as well. And there are historical sources specifically for Vasa that say there were women and children on board when it sank. And of the 15 skeletons found on the ship, 2 of them are women.
Wow. Wow. So one would imagine when the ship set sail, all of the crew and the family and all of the people would have been on the top deck?
Most people were, probably.
Yeah. And so it was a big fanfare. The day of the ship sailing, all of the people came out, both sides of the river, both sides of the harbour.
Yes, and then also lots of people in small boats apparently were
Was the
watching.
king back?
No, he was still in Poland.
Yeah.
As far as we know, he spent most of Vasa's time not in the country. As far as we know, he only saw the ship once. He inspected it in January of 1628 when he was home in between campaigning seasons.
Yeah. And we talk about the Vasa just being a ship, but he wasn't a ship. He had the most ornate. The back of him, the front of him, all were beautiful. Tell me a little bit about the work that went into the artwork of the wood carvings.
Sure. There's more than 780 sculptural elements on the outside and the inside of the ship. And we tend to think of that now as decoration. But that's not how somebody thought about it in the 17th century. It's part of the ship's function. That every warship has 2 more or less equally important functions. The physical function, to be a gun platform, or today to be a floating airport or a missile silo. But it also is a metaphysical warship. It is a symbolic vessel that represents the owner's ambition, policy, self-image. And that's a very important part of what warships do. We call it showing the flag today. But you appear in other people's ports, you appear off your own coast to remind your enemies that not to mess with you, to remind your friends you're there to help them. And so the appearance of the ship is part of that function. And in the 17th century, people focused a great deal of energy on that function by using sculpture and paint to tell stories about who they were, about who the Swedes were, about who the king was. And so there's this program of sculptures all over the ship, mostly at the bow and the stern. The sides you had to keep relatively clear because the cannon were there, and you also had rigging that would sweep the sides. But they tell very particular stories about who is Gustav Adolf, what is the country of Sweden, what kind of ambition did he have. And it uses a language of symbols that people were used to seeing in churches and on palaces.
Oh, it's absolutely it's so unique, so beautiful. So the ship is in the dock. There's concerns. We're going to set sail anyway. What happens?
The ship was launched a year before it sailed. Launching is just putting it into the water after, and the ship's only about half built at that stage. So it's been sitting in Stockholm for a year, finished, waiting for the foundry to cast enough guns for it. Because the king hasn't just ordered a new type of ship, he's also ordered a new type of gun. And what they discovered is you could build a ship faster than you could cast all the guns for a ship. So Vasa's been sitting around for a year waiting for the foundry to catch up on its order. And this has become something of a minor scandal that this ship should be going to sea, and it should be going to sea, and it should be going to sea, but the foundry hasn't delivered the guns yet. But finally, on the 10th of August, 1628, they've decided we have enough guns. Not all the guns. The ship should have 72, but 64 is enough. We need to get the ship to sea. And so on a Sunday afternoon at about 4 o'clock, it cast off from the palace, which was also the arsenal, was towed along the waterfront into a very, very weak southerly breeze until it got to the southern end of the harbor at a place called Slussen today, where it then turned left and headed east, cast and then set 4 sails. It only had 4 of its 10 sails even bent onto the yards. I think Suffring Hansen, the captain, was trying to be as absolutely careful as he could. And so he set 4 sails, and really at first was only drifting down the harbor on the current coming out from the Lake Mälaren, because the southern end of the harbor is a series of high bluffs, which shields the harbor from the wind. But once he got to the end of the bluffs, to the
like a kilometer,
about that. I think technically it's 1,250 meters or something like that, but yeah, a little more than a kilometer. And that's where all the wind from the south finally can get to the harbor, because this high ground to the south of Stockholm acts like a big funnel and takes all the wind from the south of the whole city and dumps it into the harbor in one spot. So even if it's calm everywhere else, in that one spot, there's a big blower. And so that fills the sails, and that heeled the ship over to port far enough that the lower gun ports were in the water. And so water started to run in through the gun ports. Now, that happens on ships, and ships are designed so that once they heel over, the forces in them become unbalanced and push the ship back upright. The problem with Vasa is, because the weight is so high up in the ship, once it heels to about here, it becomes stable. The forces balance here instead of here, so it's balanced with water running in through the gun ports. And so water simply continued to run in through the gun ports until it filled the deck and ran down the hatches into the hold and filled the ship, and it sank. And we think that might not have taken more than about 10 minutes.
10 minutes. And are the people on the shore still able to see Vasa?
There are still people on the shore. Vasa's just past the most populated part of the city, but there are people standing along the shore on both sides.
And I suppose some sallying might have been tried at that same time, everyone trying to run to the other side of the ship to steady?
Well, what they did try was they sent sailors below decks to try to haul the guns that were on the low port side, to haul them over to the other side of the ship to try to get it to right itself. But they didn't succeed in doing that. We can see from the archaeological situation, when the ship was excavated, all of the guns were still tied at their gun ports. So that they didn't have enough time to even get them loose and pull them up to the starboard side.
Do we have survivors?
Most of the people on board survived. We don't know exactly how many people were on board, because we don't know how many guests there were. We know how many crew there should have been. But we estimate there were somewhere between 150 and 200, maybe as many as 250 people on board. Almost all of those people were on the upper deck. And once the ship sank, they simply swam to shore. If you couldn't swim, not everybody can. Even once the ship came to rest on the bottom, the masts were out of the water, so you could hold on to the rigging until a boat picked you up. And we have at least one record of lots of boats that were following the ship came in and plucked people out of the water. It was really just the people who were trapped below decks who died, and that's only about 30 people.
Unbelievable. Vasa is now at the bottom of the Stockholm harbour, and the other ships continue to be built.
Eplet had actually been launched by that point and was in the process of being rigged when Vasa sank.
Still with 2 levels of cannon?
Still with two levels of cannon, although for its first 2 seasons, it wasn't actually armed. We think it should have entered service the year after Vasa, but there's no record it was issued any guns in that year. And then the following year, it was used as a transport to carry troops to Germany, but probably unarmed.
And so the extra meter, the wider ship of that second ship,
right,
allowed it eventually to carry and be weighted in the water.
It was part of the Navy for 30 years.
Yeah.
Although it wasn't used very much. It seems not to have been a much better ship than Vasa was. Just enough better not to sink. But it was not a popular ship in the Navy.
Was there some blame?
There was an inquest. And in fact, the earliest thing that we have that resembles a Transportation Safety Board investigation is the inquest after the loss of Vasa, for which we have the minutes. And we can see that it follows a lot of the procedures that we now associate as typical with an accident investigation. They questioned all of the surviving officers. They questioned the builders, and they had a panel of experts to evaluate the evidence to try to figure out. Well, excuse me. To try to figure out 2 things: what had happened, but also whose fault it was. It's like any government inquiry. The real object of a government inquiry is to figure out who's going to carry the can. And in this case, the questioning focused on areas that were often the problem in big ships. One was ballasting, that is, heavy weights you put in the bottom of the ship to keep the center of gravity low. In Vasa's case, it's stone, granite. It also questioned on whether the guns were secured or not. One of the things that could sink a ship is if the guns got loose and rolled all to one side of the ship. That's enough weight to heel it over. And it was testified by the master of artillery on board that no, all the guns were secured. And we can see from the archaeology that he was telling the truth. And then there was also questions about, were the crew drunk? Several people were asked that. My favorite answer in the inquest was from the ship's bosun, Per Bertilsson, who was asked, were you drunk? And he said, the only thing I had to drink was the wine at communion. So that he was in the clear. And then they also discussed about, then they questioned the designer or the builder, Hein Jacobsen, and Arend de Groot, the business partner, about the design of the ship. The ship was, okay, well, we'll accept the ship was well built, but was it badly designed and badly proportioned? And it's clear that that's what everybody thought. Everybody understood that the problem with Vasa was that it was a bad design. And then the panel of experts all commented, and they pretty much substantiated that they said the fundamental problem here is the ship doesn't have enough belly. And what they meant is there's not enough underbody, there's not enough ship in the water, and that the upper works of the ship are too tall and too heavily built. And so you never would ever be able to put enough ballast in the ship without sinking it in order to balance out to carry those heavy upper works. And we can, they didn't have the math that we have now to test that. And which was a problem in the design process, but we can see that they're right. That is the fundamental problem with the ship.
Yeah. So, okay. So, was there blame laid on any particular person? Not the shipbuilder, not the designer?
Effectively on Henrik Hubertsson, but he was dead. Yeah. He was the perfect scapegoat. Yes. He couldn't defend himself, and he didn't need to be punished. So he was the one who, even though there was no official verdict rendered as far as we can tell, everybody who testified was promoted. It didn't seem to hurt their careers at all. Even though for the captain, Sir Frank Hansen, this was the second ship that he had lost under his command in an accident. He had run another ship aground and had it captured by the enemy. So that, but he eventually was promoted to a kind of rear admiral. The ship's lieutenant eventually became a captain. The master became a captain. It doesn't seem to have hurt anybody's career that testified. And Hein Jacobsen went on to build two very successful ships for the Navy.
Was there some salvage efforts at the time to?
There were. There was an English engineer named Ian Bulmer who came to the Royal Council and claimed that he could raise the ship. And so 2 days after it sank, he was given a contract to recover the ship. And the ship, when it lay on the bottom, was leaning at an angle of maybe 15 or 20 degrees. And he succeeded in cranking it up right again, but he couldn't get it loose from the bottom. He couldn't break it free of the mud that it sunk into, and he couldn't get it to the surface. And there were attempts all through the next couple of years into the 1630s to try to recover the ship. And in fact, when the ship was found, there were over 50 anchors stuck in it. That was the remains of all of these attempts to raise the ship in the 1620s and 1630s.
So at the time, did they salvage anything from inside the ship if they couldn't raise the ship? Did they take some cannons, or is there anything that they salvaged at the time?
It doesn't look like they salvaged anything immediately, but about 35 years after the ship sank, a pair of entrepreneurs took a diving bell, one of the earliest commercially successful diving bells, to the ship, and they recovered almost all of the ship's cannon, which they were allowed to keep according to their contract. And they exported those. They sold those in Germany to be melted down to make new cannon.
And that would have been like 1670, roughly.
1663 to 65. It was 3 years of diving on the wreck, where they broke off the masts, they ripped up the upper deck, got all the guns off the upper deck, got most of the guns out of the upper gun deck, and then almost all the guns they pulled of the lower gun deck, they pulled out through the gun ports using a crane and what looked like a giant pair of salad tongs.
Oh, it's surprising to me that they were allowed to and were able to be entrepreneurial and keep what they've salvaged.
Well, I think that's interesting as well. But the privilege they received from the king specifically said that they could keep whatever they could recover. And partly it was because the guns that were on the ship were a type that had turned out not to be a very successful design.
So he didn't want them back.
No one really had a use for those guns. And by that point, the Swedish military was going over to iron guns anyway instead of bronze guns.
So then you've got another 300 years that goes by. What happens in that time? Is it still in the psyche of the Swedish people? Are we talking about it, or is it lost to history at that point?
No, it remained an event. I mean, it's such a dramatic event. It wasn't completely forgotten, and the Navy never forgot it. Every history of the Navy written after that includes a section on the loss of Vasa, partly because it's a cautionary tale for young officers: don't do this. And then once modern diving equipment, or what we call standard dress, the big copper helmet with circular faceplate and a canvas suit. When that was introduced to Sweden in the 1840s, one of the first things the officer who brought it into Sweden did with it was to dive on Vasa. And he wrote in his memoirs about walking on the deck of Vasa. And the ship
that he's in good shape. He's looking good down there.
Exactly. And the wreck is marked on harbor charts for the 19th century. And then there are other people who claim to have dived on it in the 1870s and the 1890s. And even the oral history within the Navy's dive school, which was located about 75 meters away on an island, is that they used the site as a training place until World War One for training helmet divers. And there was an application in 1920 by a salvage company to recover the guns from the ship and dynamite the ship for its wood that was turned down by the harbor authorities because the people knew where the ship was. It's in the narrowest part of the harbor, and so you couldn't have a diving operation moored there all through the sailing season. And in fact, later in the 1950s, when the modern Vasa project got started, that was a problem. That the diving fleet moored over the site was a hazard to navigation that required some special measures
to maneuver around it.
Yeah, well, and also it's right in front of the main dry dock for repairing vessels in Stockholm. And so anytime a ship needs to get in and out of the dry dock, you had to move the whole diving operation. And they eventually got to the point where they could do that in like half an hour, and on swinging moorings and all sorts of things. But so there was never, the knowledge about the wreck never completely disappeared. It just became more and more, well, it became less and less interesting.
Yeah.
There were fewer people interested because of what you could do with it. And it wasn't until the 1950s that an engineer who worked for the Navy was passionately interested in the Navy's history. And so he set himself the task of finding 12 famous naval wrecks from the 16th and 17th centuries. And he did find the two most spectacular. He found Vasa in 1956, and then in 1980 he found a ship called Kronen, which is even larger and more ornate than Vasa is.
And was that a Swedish ship as well?
Also a Swedish ship, although it blew up and sank in a battle, so it's lying on the bottom in pieces. I've dived on it. It's spectacular, but it's not an intact ship like Vasa.
Yeah.
And so he started looking in 1954 to locate the vessel, and by the summer of 1956, he had found it, relocated it. Not surprisingly, exactly where the harbor charts of the 1850s says it is.
For the listeners, Vasa is intact, and when I say that, he's actually perfect. The way that he has been displayed at the Vasa Museum, he is the most magnificent ship I've ever seen in my life.
Well, it's we have about 98% of the original timber of the ship, so it is more or less a complete ship from 400 years ago.
So he comes along in the 1950s. We're talking 300 and something years now, and he would like the contract to raise the ship. How did he do so?
Well, what Francine did was that he persuaded the key actors to all get together to do the project. He persuaded his employer, the Navy, to do that. And it happened that the commander of the Navy's diving assets was the son and grandson of an historian and an archaeologist. And so he had a passionate interest in history. So he was willing to devote the Navy's diving assets to doing this. He persuaded the National Heritage Board to provide conservation expertise. He persuaded the National Maritime Museum to provide museum expertise. And he convinced the largest private towing and salvage company in Scandinavia, Broströms, to provide their expertise for the actual raising, and all of them to do it for free. And so all of these people, out of their normal operating budgets, put together their resources to recover the ship. The Navy provided the divers. Broströms provided the salvage vessels at the surface. Heritage Board provided conservators, and the Maritime Museum provided curators. And so all of these actors got welded into this consortium, originally called the Vasa Committee, and then later called the Vasa Board. And then the king's son, Prince Bertil, was appointed the head of the board, the most popular member of the royal family. And quite well known and beloved, and so he acted as the chief fundraiser where money was needed, and the person who could go to anyone in the country and ask them to do stuff, and he could persuade them to do it. So, and so this big conglomeration of actors spent 2 years on diving work to get the ship ready to move it from it where it sank, moved it to a shallower spot in the harbor where they could then repair it underwater sufficiently that in April of 1961, when it was raised to the surface, they could just pump the water out of it and it floated again. 133 years on the bottom of the harbor.
Stuck in mud. Presumably, they're going to dig away what they can that's solidified. There'd be, mud inside the ship as well?
There was about 1,000 tons of mud and artifacts inside the ship. And the way they decided to raise it was the same method they had tried immediately after it sank. You park 2 floating vessels on the surface above it, and then somehow connect those vessels to the sunken vessel by cables. Pump the vessels on the surface full of water as low as you can go without sinking them. Tighten all the cables, and then pump the water back out of those 2 at the surface. So they rise in the water, and they'll lift the sunken ship. And you can lift a sunken ship maybe 4 meters, 5 meters that way, and then move it into shallower water until it grounds again, and then repeat that process. And that's exactly what they did between 1956 and 1959. Was they, in a series of 18 lifts, moved the ship from where it had sunk, where the water was 32 meters deep, to water about half that deep, where it was easier to work in a little bit more shelter. And then divers spent another year and a half building in the broken parts of the stern and the bow, putting covers over all the gun ports, plugs in all the empty bolt holes, so that when it was pulled to the surface at the end, it was watertight enough that you could float it into a dry dock.
And was there people on the shoreline to fanfare that?
Yeah, I think about 10,000 people watched.
Wow.
The ship brought to the surface. And the tricky bit of this was the diving work. Rather than fastening anchors or hooks or anything into the hull, they dug 6 tunnels completely under the hull and passed cables completely around the ship. And digging the tunnels helped break the suction between the bottom of the ship and the clay of the harbor bottom.
The ship itself, it is now up. People have seen it. Did they have any idea that it was going to be in such fantastic condition?
Well, they'd been working on it for 4.5 years at that point, and so they'd surveyed it pretty thoroughly to know.
What about here, if in Australia, if a ship was to sink here, there'd be so many marine life and animals that would just eat through the wood, and it wouldn't be like the Vasa. How was it that the Vasa was in that shape?
Right. You actually have a ship in Australia that is the same age and the same size as Vasa.
Oh, yes, I've read the book, Batavia, yes.
Exactly. And part of that ship does survive, and it's been raised and conserved, and it's on display in the Western Australian Maritime Museum in Fremantle. But it is mostly known because of the terrible mutiny by the ship's pharmacist and the murder of hundreds of people, and just an awful, awful story. But the ship itself, the wreck was excavated in the 1970s and 1980s. But in warm, salty water, you have things that live in the water that eat wood. The most destructive one is a mollusk called teredo. People refer to it as shipworm. It looks like a worm, but it's really a mollusk. And it just tunnels into the wood and destroys it. But that needs warm, salty water. Stockholm Harbor is neither of those things. It's 3 degrees year-round on the bottom and mostly fresh water. And there's no oxygen at the bottom of Stockholm Harbor, partly due to stagnant water, but mostly due to pollution until the World War II era. And so even at the microscopic level, there's not a lot of stuff that lives that will destroy the wood. The Baltic generally has very good conditions for preservation. Ships that sink in the Baltic tend to stay intact unless people destroy them by blowing them up or dragging anchors through them, things like that.
Is just for listeners as well. This is a ginormous museum. I had no idea what I was walking into when I first visited the Vasa. I would say the ship itself would be 3 times the size of my home. It is ginormous. It is on the beautiful harbour itself. Conservation-wise, does it take a lot to keep the ship looking the way that it does?
We have a staff of about 12 people who do nothing except look after the ship and the collections. There's also 40,000 objects found in and around the ship that are part of the collection as well. They're stored underneath the ship in the basement. And so there was a long process of preserving the ship after it was recovered that was had to be cleaned and then sprayed with a chemical preservative called polyethylene glycol, which is a water-soluble synthetic wax. You're wearing it right now, by the way. It's a standard ingredient in things like lip gloss and shampoo. It's also a food additive. So it's non-toxic, colorless, odorless, but it solidifies inside the cells of the wood and replaces the water there. So it provides mechanical strength to waterlogged wood. So the ship was sprayed with that for 17 years to get a high enough concentration in the wood that it would stabilize it. And then other objects were treated in baths of it or tanks of it. Metal objects had to be treated by other chemical processes. But then that process never really stops. We can't stop the process of decay. We can slow it down and we can challenge it, but we can't ever completely stop it. And so there's always new conservation challenges that we face. Right now, it was discovered already by the 1990s that the support structure that the ship sits in, a big steel cradle, really was not very well. It was not very well oriented to how the ship itself distributes its weight, and so the support elements aren't under the heavy spots in the hull. And so we're in the process now of replacing that support structure with an entirely new, much more sophisticated structure. And just the design process for that has been over 10 years. And then the fabrication and installation process is probably going to take us 3 years altogether until we've replaced the original structure with that support structure, which is partly complicated by the fact we can't just move the ship off the old cradle, build a new cradle, and move it back. We have to replace it piece by piece without moving the ship. One of the things we also wanted to do was to make the ship more understandable to visitors. And the new support cradle, although it will have more elements, those elements are much smaller and they're more tightly fitted to the ship. And so you'll have a much better sense of the shape of the ship underwater than you do with the current big blocky steel structure that was built in the 1960s. Support elements where they are is actually bad for the ship, so we need to remove those as well.
What year was the museum opened?
The museum that we're in now was opened officially in 1990, although it was half open, sort of a soft open, the year before, in the summer of 1989.
And where the museum sits, is that close to where the Vasa sunk?
It's about 600 meters, 500 meters from where it sank. As I like to say, you can see Vasa's entire career from the laying of the keel until today from the roof of our museum. Directly behind the museum is the Naval Cemetery. Okay. And then behind that is a very big, grand building that is the Nordic Museum, the Museum of Scandinavian Cultures. That was built in the 1890s. And then just the Navy buildings that survive this area are, to one side, there's a nightclub called Josephine that is the old canteen for the Navy Yard that's been redeveloped into a nightclub. And then in the other direction, along the waterfront, there's a series of sheds some from World War II for torpedo boats, but there's two there built in the 1740s for the Stockholm galley fleet, and those two are now the Spirits Museum, the Alcohol Museum of Swedish Drinking Culture.
We did take a really long walk after the Vasa. Listeners, you must go to Sweden. I will hand on heart tell you, Sweden, I should have been a Swede. I absolutely loved it. And the Vasa has a piece of my heart, as you can see on my wall here. And you too. What brought you to Sweden? You're from Virginia.
I am. I grew up in the United States. I studied maritime archaeology and was a professor of maritime archaeology at Texas A&M University, and then was recruited away first to the National Museum of Denmark and based at the Viking Ship Museum in Roskilde for a few years before I was headhunted by the Vasa Museum to be the head of research. So I came here for work, and in my field. Being asked to be the head of research at Vasa is like being picked for the all-star team. There's not really a better job in my field than this. So.
And is the Vasa, in your opinion, more formidable than any of the Viking ships in Denmark that you've got?
Oh, I wouldn't dare say that if there are Danes listening. The way I think about that is every country that has a coastline has an iconic ship that somehow embodies its image of itself. Usually a ship from its period of greatest prosperity or when it was most influential. And in Scandinavia, Western Scandinavia, and Denmark and Norway, it's Vikings. It's all Vikings all the time. It's very hard to get funding in Denmark to excavate a shipwreck that's not a Viking ship. And so, because in the Viking Age, the Vikings, of Denmark and Norway were world beaters. They conquered England, they conquered Normandy, they sacked towns in Italy. That's their period of international influence. Swedish Vikings went east and traveled through Russia, served in the bodyguard of the Byzantine emperor. But for Swedes, that iconic period isn't the Viking Age; it's the 17th century, what Swedes call the Great Power period, when Sweden was a dominant regional power. And so Vasa is the embodiment of that period, just like the Viking ships at Roskilde are the embodiment of that period. In England, you have, it's either the Tudors or Nelson's Navy. And so in England, you have Mary Rose, Henry VIII's warship, and you have Victory, Nelson's ship from Trafalgar. In the United States, you have USS Monitor, a ship from the American Civil War. So I think every country has, a wreck like that or a ship like that somehow, yeah. So you've got you're a big enough country that you can afford more than one. And so you've got Batavia, which is the first Europeans coming to Australasia, and then you also have Endeavour, but you also are the home of the world's oldest seafarers, because the very first people who came to Australia had to do it by water.
The indigenous.
And so the indigenous people of Australia, who have been there for 100,000 years, 50,000, a very, very long time, are in fact some of the earliest evidence of seafaring in the world, probably from Southeast Asia.
Yeah, it's interesting. Last week, I interviewed a Indigenous author of Dark Emu. Have you heard of Bruce Pascoe? No, he wrote a book. It's called Dark Emu, and it goes against all of the Indigenous history. So at school, we are taught here that Australia was terra nullius. So when Captain Cook came, and then in 1788, when the Europeans came along, it was told to us that Indigenous Australians and First Nations people didn't have aquaculture or agriculture. They didn't have settlements. Well, Bruce Pascoe is Indigenous, and he's a historian at the Victorian University, and he's found evidence that shows the aquaculture, agriculture, and the settlements. And we were talking about the age of Indigenous people, and I said, 65,000 years, and he said more, and he kept saying more. He said the more research that's being done, it is looking like 100,000.
Yeah. Well, and how did they get there? They had, so they had to cross water to get there. So the the indigenous people of Australia are the oldest seafarers known.
So with my guests, I always end with the same question. Fred, have you seen a UFO or a ghost?
Okay, and you, all right. No, I've never seen a UFO. I've never seen a ghost. Right. Well, I've never seen a ghost, but I've been in some spooky places that give you can feel history haunting them. My brother's house in West Virginia was used in the Civil War, and so it's a little spooky. And my father had a house that was even older that my brother wouldn't, after a while, refuse to go in. And I've been to historical places where you can feel the weight of history, and that's a kind of a ghostly feeling.
It's an energy.
Yeah, like the Little Bighorn battlefield. You really get a sense of what happened there. But you're going to ask, is there a Vasa ghost or a Vasa curse?
So just to reiterate, I have never seen a UFO or a ghost, but with my guests, there's a lot of different answers. So I'm just intrigued. All three of my children have seen ghosts and had the same experience, but I have never. So that's my interest. But with you, it's a bit different. It's about the Vasa.
Right. Well, there were 30 people who died there, and we have the remains of 15 of them. And I've handled those people quite a lot in the course of studying them. But I do like to joke that there is a Vasa curse. And that is that 20 years ago, when we started a project to look at the human remains and to try to learn as much as we could from them, that we wanted to get a sense of who they were. And in fact, we just published 20 years of research into that field. I'll plug the book we just published this year.
Do it.
Which is In Life and Death, a study of the human remains from Vasa. Beautiful. When that started, it was just becoming common to try to analyze DNA from archaeological remains. And so we partnered with a DNA lab at Uppsala University to see if they could extract DNA from our skeletons. And one of the best places for DNA to be preserved is in your teeth. And so we decided that we would start that process to generate a baseline. We would extract one tooth, a molar, from each skull of 10 people to see if we could get DNA out of them. And I was the director of research, and I made the decision that it was worthwhile to sacrifice these teeth. We would do that. And then my wife, who was the head of conservation and the daughter of a dentist, said that she would take responsibility for extracting a tooth without damaging any of the surrounding bone. And so she did the same thing. And so we sent these teeth off. And within a month of us making the decision to do that,
oh, stop it.
Both of us had to have a molar removed.
Both of you. So for our listeners,
I joke that that's the Vasa curse.
Lost a molar, and your wife as well.
Yep. And then 10 years later, DNA techniques had improved, and so we wanted to do a second round. And this time, the DNA specialist said they wanted to take examples by sawing through the leg bones, and I said, I'm out. I'll lose a tooth. I'm not losing a leg. No. We ended up taking. Eventually, we extracted successfully about 65 bone samples, from which we've gotten the DNA that lets us match disassociated elements back to the remains. And we've learned things about those people. Some stuff is not exactly shocking. They're mostly blonde and blue-eyed. That's we can see that from DNA. And we learned really trivial, historically unimportant stuff like who had wet earwax and who had dry earwax.
Oh.
But we can also see if people are related. We get a sense of how they were built because the mixture of slow twitch and fast twitch muscle in your body is a genetic characteristic. So we can see if people were natural sprinters or marathoners. Are they built for power, or are they built for endurance? People are typically built more for one than the other. We can get some idea of where their family comes from. So all of our people we can see are from families that are probably based in Scandinavia. And then we can also do chemical tests of the bones that will tell us what they ate and where they grew up and where they lived the last 10 years of their lives. And so we can place these people, these 15 skeletons, on the map of Sweden and Finland to some degree. So it's worth losing a tooth over.
That's incredible. I had my DNA done, and I'm pretty much Scottish. A little bit of Irish, a little bit of Northern England, but I'm a Scot.
Yeah, and that's not exactly a surprising combination.
No.
Yeah. If you found out that you had Sri Lankan background somewhere, you might be more surprised.
Might be a bit more shocked. Yes. But I was hoping to have been a Swede, I will be honest.
Well, and the thing that those tell you, especially in modern populations, because we are so mixed now, it's actually easier with people from the 17th century because people didn't move around quite so much. Is what they're giving you they're giving you probabilities. When your DNA test comes back and it says 12% Irish, it doesn't mean that 12% of your DNA is Irish. They're just ranking the possibilities or the most likely outcomes of where your family comes from.
Well, Fred, I honestly thank you so much for coming on with me. You've been a pleasure to chat with.
Well, it's been my pleasure, Belle. Thanks a lot.
And trust me, I'll be back to the Vasa. I'm going to bring my husband and my family, and we're all going to visit again.
Well, give me a call when you do. We'll show you a little behind the scenes as well.
Private tour. Thank you, Fred. Right.